I want to introduce Caroline and James, and they're both Exiteers working with the grafter. I'll let them share a little bit of an intro about themselves. But for the purpose of this session, the intention is we're going to run for about 45-50 minutes. And the three of us are going to talk a little bit about our experience of building and selling businesses. I've got a couple of questions for Caroline and for James, and then we'll kind of open up or attempt to open up for questions from the audience. We'll see how we manage to navigate that. But Caroline, do you want to kick us off and give us a little bit of a background on your journey?
I can happily. So, hi everybody, my name is Caroline Carruthers. I have been a CIO, CTO, CDO, Chief Data Officer. Now I'm a Chief Exec. I'm collecting chief titles for a laugh, I think. It's a new hobby, in case anybody's interested in it. I was one of the first Chief Data Officers, definitely the first female Chief Data Officer in the UK. As a result, I write books on data, I speak on the radio, TV, national press, trade press, and just at the end of that, it would be remiss of me to say that it would be remiss of me if I didn't say I run my own data consultancy.
We'd be very disappointed if we didn't hear that you ran a data consultancy after that.
That would be a bit bad, wouldn't it? So yeah, and then I feel like partridge on the pear tree at the end of that should be.
Absolutely that. Thank you, Caroline. And James, do you want to do a quick intro?
Yeah, quick intro. So, as Rachel suggested, I'm now an Exiteer with the grafter. My background actually is in consumer marketing, so spent my formative years in the Coca-Cola company and then latterly in financial services. Stepped out of that about 15 years ago and founded my first business, which I left in 2014, 2015, and then Heresy Consulting, which I left last August. So the conversation that you may have later about how, what's that experience like post business, I think is really interesting and actually important and often not talked about. I don't have any of the C-suite titles, so that would be.
But you've never been called a name beginning with a C before, James. I just frankly don't believe you.
Frequently, but not in an official capacity. But I guess my area of interest has always been people. So both the businesses I've built have been around people. The first one, mainly by accident, ended up focusing almost predominantly in healthcare, specifically big pharma, biotech, and a lot of it US, UK related, and then various qualifications in psychology and psychotherapy and so on and so forth.
Those skills come in very handy at the grafter, James. We're all in need. So yeah. You found your spiritual home.
Yes.
So thank you, James. I'll do a very brief intro myself for those who don't know me. I've built and sold a couple of companies. Sold the last one in 2020, a business called Different. And that was very much a concept to sale over a period of 1,000 days. It was actually 1,042, but that doesn't sound as good. So I rounded down for the purpose of a clickbait title. And my motivation now is around helping entrepreneurs to maximise the value of their business prior to an event, whether that be raising or exit. And I can talk about myself for hours, so I will pause at that point and not go off on a mad one. I guess the first question I want to pose to Caroline and James is around the businesses that you've built before. If I look back on experiences I've had, there tends to be 2 or 3 standout moments when you're running a business where you think, this was a really big hurdle that I've overcome, or it's, as you've moved into a new sector, it's those kind of fundamental bits where you think this really has been a bit of a game changer. So I'd like you to share what those key bits were in your previous or current businesses, and then we're going to talk a little bit about those. So James, do you want to kick us off and share 2 or 3 of the key kind of defining moments in businesses that you've run before?
And again, I won't take these in any order, but I guess, for most businesses during the period of the last 10 years, which feels like an awfully long time, COVID was a significant piece. We had largely built a face-to-face, all of our work was face-to-face in person at that point. And definitely in person, either at client site or off client site was the default. And we used Zoom to some degree, but it was very sporadic and basically not something we did. And indeed, most of the work that we did, which was leadership development work, was assessment work and coaching and a sort of other bits and pieces. There was a view that you couldn't do that work at any sort of depth online. And for the first 2 months of COVID, we basically sat and looked at each other and thought that we were going to have to basically put ourselves in a holding pattern for a year, or as long as that lasted. And so I think one of the biggest shifts for us was recognizing actually the way that we could then leverage Zoom or Google Meet or Teams in service of doing the work. And the reason I raise that is because coming out of COVID, the default clearly became face-to-face, which massively increased the profitability of the business, but also I think the quality of the product that we were able to bring. So it gave us much greater scope, both to work with people all over the world, but also fundamentally to bring in associates. For example, we struggle to find associates of the requisite quality in parts of Asia or in the US or in Australia, but we were able essentially to more accurately match the talent with the individual. And so we had people in the US working with people in Asia and vice versa. It gave us a significant greater degree of flexibility.
It's really interesting that, James, because that we talked about this before, but for lots of us, for me, COVID and running a healthcare consultancy was, if you looked at it on paper, it didn't get any better as we were starting to plan for an exit, because of course it drove our number in a different way. Likewise, we had always been on-prem, normally other people's premises, mind. But overnight we had to flip to remote and we had no choice. We needed to keep people safe. But for me with COVID, it played a really positive, not for me personally, but for the business, a really positive aspect, because it probably drove an additional $1 million of revenue during 2019, which of course directly contributed to where we went in way of multiple as we sold the business. But I think, Caroline, we'd spoken before, it had the reverse effect, didn't it, for you?
Completely, Tony. I was going to jump in there. So to give a little bit of backstory, because COVID was an absolute defining moment for us, but a little bit of a backstory. And with hindsight, I had no business setting my own company up at the time. With hindsight, wonderful gift that. But we'd had the easiest start I think you could possibly have to having a company set up. So the only reason we set the company up was because on the back of the books that we've been writing and the response that people were having to the theories and the stuff that we were writing, we had a list of companies lined up going, please, can you come and help us do this for ourselves? So our client list was amazing. And that's why we set the company up. So we set it up, we started working with them, we had a bank of consultants, but because it was almost too easy, and then we had all international clients. So we had clients across Africa, America, other places. Every single one of them at the time was international. And I can't say I didn't enjoy that period, because having our clients fly us business class and first class around places was a hardship. However,
I mean, someone's got to take one for the team, mate.
Yeah. It was heartbreaking. I can honestly tell you, I still remember what first class and BA was like. But but it was easy. So I think if I'm honest, a little bit lazy about how we were structuring some of the things that we were structuring. It was just like, it was just never ending giving it to us at the time. And I remember COVID hit and we watched it, and I was actually in Africa, in Johannesburg, as they're starting to shut countries down, desperately trying to get home. Managed to make it home. I think I came back on Saturday. They shut the UK down on the Tuesday. It was that close, so I couldn't get an earlier flight. And then I spent the next day with phone call after phone call after phone call with people stopping our business, and we lost everything, every single client we had in one day.
And was that because at that time there wasn't the infrastructure to deliver, or your business model was normally we roll in on site, and so therefore it was perceived as couldn't deliver?
It was absolutely perceived we couldn't deliver everything we'd done. You know, literally we've been traveling around the world working with these companies, and because a lot of the work we've been doing had been very strategic and everybody went down to tactical, we don't have time to think about the big picture now. We have to deal with the here, the now, the practical. But what it did was, James, a bit like you, I mean, we didn't spend 2 months, but we did spend about 2 weeks going, what the effing hell are we going to do now? And we did have a discussion about, do we shut? Do we, you know, what? So we had that kind of come to Jesus type moment. But I think what we built from there, deciding to go, right, we're going to go ahead and do it. What we built from there was so much more sustainable. And I would argue that's probably the point we became a proper business. But it was not the way I would like to learn that lesson, but that was probably a big pivotal moment for us.
A bit of a baptism of fire. And what about from the other side? If I think about different, you know, and kind of fundamental stages, COVID played a really key part, but probably the biggest milestone for us was when we shifted to delivering outcomes, and we actually won our first outcome-based piece of work. So we weren't supplying people in. We were a people business, but we weren't supplying people. We were owning the risk, taking the responsibility for delivering that. And the irony, of course, was, you know, we were London-based at that time. First outcome was up in Newcastle, other ends of the country. We ended up being up there for about 10 months almost solidly. But that for us, once we'd got one outcome, I mean, don't get me wrong, we marketed it well, as is my nature. But we, you know, that snowballed, because that first outcome became second 2 or 3 months later for Public Health England, became, and then we were well into that camp, I guess. What about other defining moments for Carruthers and Jackson?
So I think the other one, I'm going to flip almost to the end of our story because I'm jumping around a little bit, but I think it was a very defining moment, was once we'd got over that kind of hurdle and actually we'd got the business and we were flying, we got to the point of actually building a proper business. And I think for me, the next big moment was when we were courted, and that's probably the nicest I can put it, by another company that wanted to buy us. And they were a huge company and talked quite obscene figures, quite frankly. Blew my mind, and it was all
first class flight figures, or more obscene?
Definitely first class flight figures, first class yacht figures. Some of these figures were ridiculous, and it was, they'd come after us, hadn't been thinking about selling at all at that point, and them coming after us and courting us, and literally, when I think back now to the amount of money that we spent by the time we'd had the proper valuation, lawyers, went through the process, quite far through the process, and then completely ghosted. And I think you have to experience it to go, how could you go from talking on the telephone, literally on the telephone, on a daily basis for months, to it's like you didn't exist? I have an idea about what happened because I've seen share prices of the big company since then and what they were going through at the time. But that was a real eye opener for us. But it kind of, it was at that point I started thinking, I was only selling because of the numbers they were talking about. And, you know, Rachel, you know, this part of the journey, which is when I started to go, actually, I need to be controlling my own destiny here.
Yeah. It's interesting though, Caroline, because I've subsequently spoken to a number of entrepreneurs who have had a similar experience for varying different reasons. And that wasn't my journey. We were approached, and we were approached probably November 2019. We had been very intentional about it was in and out in 5 years. So I knew that when I set different up. I didn't want to be working anywhere for any period of time because I'd only ever been an interim. I had no frame of reference for longer than 2.5 years. There was nothing scientific in it. I just thought if I'm my own boss, I might be able to handle 5 years. That was it.
Rachel, as being one of your bosses, I think that's an adequate amount of time.
Being one of my bosses and us still talking is a miracle, mate. But I think that that process for me, I was really intentional. But so 2.5 years in, we went out. But even before we almost got out, we had the sale pack, and then someone knocked on the door, and we went through the process of let's bring another couple in because we want to drive this number up. But the bit that I did not plan for was how sodding time consuming. That courting of 3 potential interested parties who actually have full teams of people that do this for a living and aren't running the business. And I was driving probably 85% of the number. So, of course, it therefore our numbers had a direct impact, not of the positive variety, for that 6 to 9 month period whilst I was being courted, negotiating. And then I think I started to understand that's why you bring in a team around you, not just the lawyer, the corporate finance, but somebody who's actually been there and seen it, done it before, because it's almost impossible to manage that process. What about you, James?
Well, I'm talking about exit was slightly different in the sense that I sold to the existing partners in the business. And we've talked about this before. The exit itself actually was extremely smooth, albeit took, as these things do, significantly longer perhaps than either of us had hoped. But I guess if you talk about a pivotal moment, there was a moment probably around COVID where we recognized that we were a proper business, but we really had no systems and processes that were repeatable in place. And one of those things was around proper documentation of the relationships between us, the valuation methodology that we might use. And because we put that in place like 5-6 years before, when we came to this exit, I remember the meeting where we agreed all the parameters of that was an hour long. Because we just went through the agreement and said, well, we agreed this, so is that still the case? Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
The valuation would always be the most contentious, and even there, it was, are you going to sell all your shares? Yes. What value we're going to use? Well, the same one as we've used all the way along, or at least the same methodology. So my experience was actually relatively smooth in that regard. I guess, the area that really interests me and continues to interest me actually in the work that we're doing is the moment earlier in the business where the foundations for the type of business you become is set up. So I'm particularly interested in niching. I'm particularly interested in productizing businesses. It's kind of my background. And yet my experience in both the businesses that I've had is there have been key moments where clients tempt you to do the thing that is not the reason you set up.
I think you might just have described about 9 months of my journey with a grafter there.
Yeah.
You get sidetracked, don't you? Or somebody dangles something and you think, I must go and get involved.
Well, completely, and for good commercial reason. Like the opportunities that were offered were significant. One particular client we had a particular specialism in assessment and development, and this client said, we like that methodology, but actually what we want you to do is to drive some culture change work for us. And our first response, which I think was the right response, was we don't do that. But over the course of 6 months, engaged in some conversations, which meant that we ended up doing that. And over the course of 3 years, unbelievably lucrative contract with a very high profile brand. But actually, if I look at the essence of the business and what the business is really, really good at, I think, was assessment and development. And one wonders, and I wonder with this, with the previous business, what might have happened if we had really zeroed in on that niche, and what shape that might have taken and where we may have gone. Now, I've got no control, like I didn't do one and the other, and therefore I can get a sense of it. But as I speak to other founders and I look at businesses that are successful, it feels to me that the ones that keep it relatively simple and are very clear on what they do are building, probably initially, those are brave decisions that you make, but actually are building really interesting, scalable businesses. And it's really clear what they are and what they're not.
It's particularly poignant, that, I think, James, because for different at the outset, we went so wide because, you think I must appeal to everybody. And therefore, we're casting the net nice and wide. We're going to pick up, more and more business. And that just isn't the case. I think the niche bit is absolutely where people start to really earn their stripes. As we moved into, the UCD around healthcare and building, the design and build of those services and the kind of build and buy, but, very niche healthcare, central government, arm's length bodies, not every aspect of, that's when we really kind of took off. But I think the inclination, we messed around with all manner of business change. We were doing bloody everything at the outset to try and appeal to the masses. But as we sort of really bottomed out and I think got clear about what we were good at, I think we also caught a cold in, we took on work that wasn't in our sweet spot, and it was a bloody drama for all parties concerned.
For me, that's the key thing. I mean, if you looked at margins, the core business was always the core business that we were really good at was always the more profitable business, and the other stuff was attractive because often it was big volume, but actually the margins on that big volume and the effort in the implementation of it were nothing like the core business. So I think that's key. I would counter. I think in the product market fit way, I think a period of experimentation as you land the proposition into the market and see where the opportunity. I've got no problem with that, but I guess for me it's, which we weren't, and this is in hindsight, is being really intentional about that being the approach, and also recognizing that at some point it is useful to focus on the thing that you find you set the business up to do. Actually,
this is where I would jump in again, because I guess this is my third pivotal, but again, it's a slightly different. I feel like I've got everything backwards, but it just goes to show there's no way around it doing this thing, is it? Because actually, when we started off, we were very niche. So we were a strategic data consultancy. We focused on strategy, we focused on maturity, vision, literacy, and governance, and we could list those things out, and that's what we helped organizations with. It was part of, and I think that was really clear to organizations what we were, what we did. But this was part of where it helped my decision when we'd got through the whole being courted, being ghosted. Actually, what did I want? So if I'm jumping in with
it's like a bad dating analogy, that, isn't it? Being courted, then ghosted.
Yeah.
You know what? I'm past the Tinder generation. You know I am. Been married for 26 years, so this is the closest I'm going to get to it. I love my husband, really. Just don't tell me that. So what happened was, and Rich, this is why you and I started talking again about this particular side, and it was, what did I really want to happen? Now, I had two sort of main motivations at the time, and part of it was about being too niche. So one was, as you know, I had a few health scares and things like that, so I needed to do something that took some of the pressure off me and did it. But I still feel like this was my baby and I wanted to be part of it. But the second part, which was more the business part, about a little bit too niche, was I was getting a little bit tired of doing what I figured was quite hard stuff, which was working on organizations with their strategy. We'd be doing fixed price strategies, so we'd do some really, I think, impressive stuff at the time, figure out the strategy, and then somebody technically would come along to implement the strategy, and they'd add another couple of zeros on the top of what I'd earned to do that. So part of it was to create this whole idea of end-to-end for data with us, which is what we've actually created now. So we can literally go from talking strategy in the boardroom through to creating a Tableau dashboard if you need to. We're still in this niche. We still wanted to be this part of it. And I think that's where you could be too niche as well. And that's what we fixed with my partial exit.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense, and I think it's proportionate, isn't it? So it's not all things. It is, let's double down on the things that we're really good at, rather than going so incredibly niche that you can't therefore provide the end to end. I'd like to move us along a little. The bit that I'd like to explore, I guess there's a couple of questions. One is around the kind of the technical process of going through an exit. If you can, I mean, mindful some of the stuff is commercial and can't be shared, but would be good to get your views on the technical part of that, and then the other bit is around the personal impact on you as a founder going through an exit, and how well kind of prepared were you mentally, identity, another emotionally around that. And I'll just kick off very briefly from a personal perspective and say, from a technical perspective in selling different. We got lots of it right. We got lots of it wrong. We had the sell pack early doors. We had an incredible lawyer, courtesy of my father, who said, "You've never listened to anything I've had to say in 40 odd years. For Christ's sake, she's my lawyer," because she's bought me a number of companies over the years. So that was solid advice. And Sean is a lawyer that I often recommend to people going through this process. I think my kind of key learning from the technical aspect wasn't about the valuation. It wasn't about the documentation. My learning came in the earnout. And that was a recognition for me. I've never been much of a rule follower. I'm not keen on authority. I know it's a revelation for you, Caroline. And so I found it really hard work working for somebody else. And I found it particularly hard work working for a listed business, because I wasn't used to, 5-day flash reporting around my numbers. And to James's earlier point, I was all about the people, and suddenly it felt like it was all about the numbers, and I found that really, really uncomfortable. However, I'd summarize my last transaction as saying, if I had my time again, I would do the same deal with the same business. And I think if we look back on it and we think that's a really positive outcome. But I'm very keen to hear from you folks around your kind of experiences on the technical and the personal side. Caroline, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So I think I've kind of touched upon a little bit going through the first part of the process, which was god awful. And it was one of those wonderful, it kind of taught me what I didn't want to happen. So this is where I blow a little bit of smoke up Rachel's arse, so everybody forgive me for this one. But actually the second part time was much easier, because this was when Rachel and I were talking, and this is when I had a sounding board, and this is when, we spent time figuring out what it was I wanted before we went out to look for. So actually when I partially exited, it was, I went out to there was 2 organizations, and one in particular that I was after, and they went, good God, yes, they wanted to go through this journey. And actually, I think it was, I phoned the chief exec of that company on the Thursday, and on the Sunday we ended up having Sunday lunch together to kind of flesh out the biggest part of the deal, because I went in with this sense of clarity that I didn't have the first time I went through the process. So it was much easier going, these are my red lines. This is the stuff I'm prepared to negotiate. But if you can't hit those, there is no point in talking about any of these. So that part, so exactly like you touched upon, having the right team about you, having the right kind of clarity makes the process so much easier. But you need to be prepared for the amount of work that comes with, if you're trying to run the business, it is so easy to get distracted and focus on this stuff. And even the second time around, our business took a dip to go back up again. So we're 4 times the size of what we were when we went into the process, but the first year of it, we halved. So it was this kind of bizarre curve that we went through. Emotionally, again, slightly different in that I'm still part of the business, but I do feel like I've got a boss now. He jokes about it because I think he doesn't really feel like he is my boss at times, the way I act. But
Feels like there's a bit of a similarity there. There's another podcast to be had about managing the unmanageable at a later stage.
But it's probably a good one, yeah, managing the unmanageable. But I think for me, so I still have a foot in the camp and I've got the stuff that I wanted. Now, I'd say pretty much like you, there has been hiccups, there has been conversations, and as everybody who's spent any time with me knows, I can be a little bit fiery. I know that's a surprise to people, but I can be occasionally. We've been through those kind of times, but I would say 80% positive, which I think from talking to other founders is a fantastic percentage to be positive compared to negative of the whole process. So that would kind of be my view on it.
Yeah, I think that's I think we're in the minority to have had such a high percentage of positivity, if that makes sense. And James, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, this is less about me and just more a broader observation, which I think the majority find any sort of earn-out challenging. Partly because in any deal there is the spoken expectations of particularly why we're buying your business, and an underlying driver which is either not conscious or is conscious and not spoken about, which is the real reason why the business is bought. And often that plays out post the deal. And there is always an acquired party and acquiring partner. There are always interesting power dynamics that come with that, and working through those I think is really important. Having an open dialogue I think is critical. My advice to any founder who I speak to is take as much as you can up front, because everything else after that essentially is a negotiation.
Yeah.
And whilst people will tell you it's linked to real numbers, the structure of the business, the way that business is measured, the opportunity that's available to that business, your level of control completely shifts, and you've really got no way of predicting that. So it's great to hear your experience, Caroline, but as I say, I think it is in the minority. I think for me, as I said earlier, my process was relatively smooth because we were very clear relatively early who would buy us and who wouldn't, and therefore what the likely passage for exit was, and therefore what we needed to have in case any of us chose to leave at any given point. And therefore when that eventually happened, and it took, if I think from the point where I thought I probably need to move on to the point where I actually moved on, it's quite a gap. But when that moment came, I think the transition actually was relatively easy. My reflection is less about that and more about the sort of lived experience post-exit, which, I would equate to, if you think about the sort of classic grief cycle, very much experienced, a number of aspects of that. And the curious thing for me is I've coached a number of founders through that process, through that period. Yeah. But when you're experiencing yourself, you have some ability to ask yourself the right questions. But the most profound thing I found was that without the title and without the connection, I have been and still continue to ask myself the question, who am I apart from, the director of that business? Because it shows, if you're involved in the sort of businesses that we are, and that people who are on the call I'm sure are, with the best one in the world, it runs your life. It is the rhythm for your life for an extended period of time. And when it's not there, all of a sudden you go, oh, that was quite important. And so it's taking me a while to refine that rhythm. And for me, I would say that's all about identity transition. So it's been messy and really inconvenient at a point where I want to transition. And it also feels really important, actually, so that you don't leap from one thing into a suboptimal next. I think there's a moment reflection required. However, you choose to do that, and that can be sitting down and thinking about it. It can be experimenting with a whole bunch of stuff. It can be a whole variety of things.
I think that's particularly important, that bit, James.
Yep.
For me, as I left Different, there was a huge amount of grief. I was, kind of very attached to the team. We often refer to the team as a dysfunctional family and other terms. And so we all knew way more about each other than we should have done. And I found it felt like ripping my bloody heart out. And I can still feel that emotion in talking about it today. And the advice that I got at that time was, do not jump straight into something else. Take 6 months. I think I took 3. And then, I went off on a mad one. I went and did a bloody psychedelic retreat to, try and get in touch with myself.
You went to Ukraine to deliver more supplies, health supplies. I remember you doing that.
Well, yeah, and that's it. But I think it's I have an innate need to be busy and adding value. It terrified me, the thought of, not contributing, I think, if I'm totally honest. But in the end, my wife said, if you're going to tool around in Ukraine with no medical experience or military, just build another company because it's less stressful. But the inclination there would have been to build another agency, because I'd built 2 before, and that was not actually going to be the case. But I think solid advice around taking the time, sitting with those emotions. They're deeply uncomfortable, and a lot of us are, in my case, very ADHD. We're very driven, so we want to kind of go again. But I think really understanding what it is you want to do is super important before jumping straight back in, because just creating a distraction for yourself is not going to be fulfilling enough. Would be my view.
Yeah.
You have to plan to do something, but during that 6 months, it should be a completely different something.
And I was like worn out. I was absolutely knackered, because go through the process of selling the business, then you land, you're running at a new number in a new environment, you've had no break. So I was completely burnt out. Also in that weird phase of burnt out, bit frazzled, felt like I just had to carry on anyway. It's like, you must stop. And decompress and do whatever it takes to create some space mentally and physically, to be honest.
Yeah.
James, Caroline, anything else you'd like to add while we're awaiting these questions?
I think the only thing I was going to add is it kind of relates back to the finding yourself something else to do. But it is planning for it. There's everybody's got a burning desire, something. I know bizarrely, I already know what I'm going to be spending my 6 months doing when I eventually full exit, which is all part of the process. And it's the nice little having a back burner thing to do it. So having something that you're thinking about is always useful for people.
I think that's true. I'd also add, in terms of thinking about the conversations in the business, and I think this is particularly true in the UK versus other parts of the world. But the conversation about exit never happens early enough. And indeed, actually, the sort of deeper conversation about motives doesn't happen often enough. And I think it is not unusual, as the business grows over a number of years, that those motivations shift. And there's almost an inbuilt assumption that the motivations we started this with remain the same. And I just don't, if you think about it on a 9-10 year cycle, all of us change so significantly during that period that they have to shift. And so having an active dialogue, an active opportunity on a 6 monthly, probably an annual basis, to engage in that conversation feels important, because it isn't the primary vehicle on which you shape the business, but it is really a really important one. And so a lot of the work, Rach, you and I do, and Caroline as well, is around helping people put in place the right artifacts in order to prepare them for the potential to exit.
Yeah.
And I think that could happen much sooner, should happen much sooner, actually.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I often find, so talking with entrepreneurs in, different countries versus the UK, we have such a taboo about thinking and talking about wanting to exit over here. Yet you talk to a US audience and they are planning from the outset in way of, I'm building this to sell, create, that, and they're really open about that. But there seems to be a reluctance from a UK perspective to, to signal that, and maybe that is upsetting the apple cart from from a team perspective or from a client perspective. Or maybe it is just the cultural norm in the UK to keep some of this stuff to
Well, we don't like to talk about money.
Yeah, that is very true. We don't like talking, but also the aspirations of the business as well. So to kind of pick up on points that both of you have raised. So part of my experience was when we started, Rachel, very much like you, the people that I started who were working with me at the very beginning, it was like a dysfunctional family. We were in each other's lives. We knew far too much about each other. What was hard was we hit a point where the expectations from one of them in particular, who I'd been incredibly close to, differed significantly from what I wanted from the business, and kind of I owned it, so I pulled rank, and I was looking for bigger, better. They wanted this nice little small band of musketeers and it nothing to change. And actually what happened was, if you can imagine having a friend that you trusted implicitly turning into your internal terrorist because they were not happy with the way that the business was going.
Yeah.
I ended up having to sort that situation out, but in the process I lost what for me at the time was a really valuable friend.
Yeah, and I do think that bit is more common. The amount of conversations I have with people who've had a fallout drama with a business partner, and I mean it is, I liken, bringing business partners together. It's a bloody marriage. It's complicated. It's probably one of the most complicated, but also as the business takes off and there's a lot of money involved, that is when you start to see some odd behavior from people.
Sorry, Rach, just add one quick thing. It's also just when we talk about treating people like a family and things like that, I do think that's something we need to be cautious of, because we have to remember at the end of the day, they're not family, they're
great. Yeah, and you're going to have to make hard decisions.
And you're going to have to make hard decisions. And it's
and there are plenty of dysfunctional families.
Plenty of them.
Show me one that isn't, James.
We've got some, mine of course. We've got some questions, I think.
We have. So first question. Great to hear this session. How has recent volatility, Brexit, COVID, Trump interest rates affected valuations, and do buyers take this into account? Who fancies having a punt at this one, or I will bundle in?
Well, I can jump in with a couple of those. So obviously I've talked about what COVID did for us. It wiped us out, but it made us build better. We built much better as a result of it. Brexit, because we're a consulting business, less so. It really hasn't had that kind of impact on us. Interestingly enough, and I am not casting any political allegiance here, Trump's been really good for us. Sorry, guys. He was, as an American president, he was the person that dictated that every US department had to have a chief data officer, at which point in time you had to have a strategy, so somebody had to help them do those kind of things. The volatility around the regulations that he imposes actually plays to my space. We end up doing a lot more advisory work. So I think you've got to you have to look for your own opportunities depending on whatever else is happening in the world.
I particularly like that, and I think the skill with entrepreneurs is not in going, oh, what an absolute drama. It's like, well, this is the set of pieces we've got to deal with. Let's play it and find a way around it. I think for me, around valuations in the UK right now, James and I have had lots of experience of doing valuations over the last few months. There's no denying they're down on where they were. But also, if we think about a lot of the businesses we work with are in healthcare, either healthcare or consultancies. So for healthcare, valuations are down because in 2021 they were through the roof. Consultancy land, we've got a lot of consolidation. We've had 3 major acquisitions of consultancies during January. So for me, I think there's huge amount of opportunity, but I would urge entrepreneurs to get creative and think about solving these problems for your clients in a different way. Just reading out the same old playbook isn't going to cut it at the minute. James, anything to add to that?
No, I'd agree with that. I also think it depends which side of the pond you're on. I think the US market, as it always does, but particularly now, feels very buoyant, very optimistic. I think UK, Europe, I mean, the mood music from UK, Europe in the last 3 years has been pretty negative. But even that having been said, I think for, good businesses with good fundamentals, with very clear niches, as we've really demonstrated literally just today, there's lots of money in the system. But I think, as you say, Rach, I think you need to be much more clinical in your capacity to access the opportunity in the market and also be able to communicate that. I think, the times of being relatively lazy about that and being able to access money have gone.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I think there's one other bit that I would add to that, and a skill that I'm learning at the minute with Chris's help from the Grafter team, is that the skill and the art of storytelling, and really being able to bring it to life, the personal impact that you're making, whether it's for an individual or for a business, but is fast becoming, in my opinion, a skill that entrepreneurs, founders, founding teams really need to get all over, because being able to articulate your services, your value, but then the impact that you've made, and not in an old school case study way, but the true impact from a personal perspective. And then as you start to think about shaping up the materials for a potential sale, again, that skill goes forward. So I think, different skills, different ways. Caroline, did you want to come in there?
No, I was just agreeing with you. It is that storytelling skill. And the only other thing I'm kind of going to add slightly, so we touched upon it, I don't think we're really explicit about it, is really understanding a USP. So, I mean, what is the bit that you have that nobody else has? Because that's the bit you're negotiating on. Yeah. We know the different models for working out a rough range for what your business is worth, but that's the point that you'll end up arguing about.
Yeah, and that being based on some fundamental truths about your business. So I'm reminded of that Buffett quote where he suggests that when the tide goes out, we'll realize who's swimming naked. So I think the storytelling is important, the USP is important, but I think they only stand up to the scrutiny of due diligence, which, as you correctly suggested, is 6-9 months. They only stand up if they're based on a truth about the business, which clearly that feels important to stress.
One of the bits that we really do emphasise as part of the Grow, Raise, Exit programme is encouraging people to be absolutely honest about where the business is, because it will, if you're pulling back the duvet, you're going to see what's underneath during DD. And here's the news: if you're not declaring it, immediately you've got a massive trust issue, which is going to, derail.
But the honesty goes both ways. Again, we talked about the whole, now we're British type attitude that we have as well. So it's like, be honestly positive as well as honest about any problems that you've got. This is no time for modesty, for God's sake.
Yeah, I've heard that message loud and clear. I've never found that
not a problem I see you suffering from.
Never a time for modesty, as far as I'm concerned, Caroline. I'm mindful that we are about 3 minutes out, so I want to just get a short answer from each of us for this other question, which is, what would you do differently next time round? So if you were selling a business again, James, what would you do differently?
Can I have 2?
We'll let you.
Quick ones. I think I'd ignore the attraction of being all things to all people. And I think I'd take my own advice, which is advice I give myself in hindsight, which is I'd have these conversations about expectations, and about exit significantly early, and make it a live rhythm that the business pays attention to.
Yeah, I like that. Caroline?
I think I've kind of partially answered a little bit by some of the answers that I've given to other things, but I'd stress have the right team around you. So make sure you've got the right people on your side and that you're really honest with yourself about your motivations. So it makes a big difference to going through the process.
I think I really like that. I think for me, I would be, I'd be making sure that the business can run without me rather than later. And I would be factoring in how to, I'd be trying to factor in some downtime around that exit process, and not really downtime, some space. So what I mean by that is, let off a bit of steam after the transaction. That just wasn't a possibility. And I desperately needed it. And so, does that mean next time round I'd, move myself into a chair role rather than CEO, so I wasn't as integral to the day-to-day. But again, it's just planning. It's more planning, isn't it? It's more thinking through.
The trouble is, Rach, when you start to do that kind of things, you can upset the apple cart in your business because people have an idea about what you're doing. So you need to balance what you can personally do with keeping the lights on while you're going through the process. Sorry.
I thought you were just saying that nobody would buy me as being mature enough to be a chair. And I mean, you're probably very right.
Rachel, was the thought of you sitting in a chair for any period longer than 5 minutes was the bit that got me.
We're in PB material. We've had a full hour of it here. So that does bring us to a close, though, folks. So that just leaves me to say a massive thanks for your time, and a big thanks to everybody for joining us today. And I will look forward to putting another one of these on in the not too distant future. Have a good rest of your Tuesday. Thank you very much, both.
Thanks all. Thanks, Rose.
Take care. Thanks, everyone.